Hi everybody, Matt back with you. Hope you're okay. Today I'm on the Rochdale Canal as it passes through Todmorden. An advance warning, today's video, thank you geese, does feature potential graphic content in description, not in visual. So just putting that out there as a warning for anybody, so viewer discretion might be advised for this particular film. So this is the Rochdale Canal as it looks in 2023. Our story today goes back nearly 150 years to 1875. Life in Todmorden in 1875 was very tough. Poor living conditions, no money, and there were outbreaks of various diseases such as smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, the latter of which was claiming a lot of young lives in the town. And the town was basically full of mills at that point, and often if you didn't work in the mill you'd probably be in the workhouse. It sounds very Dickensian. That is actually what life was just like here 150 years ago. So this area of the canal is where our story begins today. If you look across, although it's a bit dark today, you might be able to see potential remains of a mill wall. And there was a mill that came here, across to here, and it was called Lord Brothers Canal Side Mill. And it looks very different today. So it's still called Canal Street, even though really there is no street to anything but car parks today. However, 21st of January 1875, an event happened here that has been described as the worst industrial accident to ever hit Todmorden. So this is a drawing of what Lord Brothers looked like at Canal Street Works. Now pretty much none of this exists today, but I've put myself into a microscopic form so I can try and point out where some things are. So if you go off where I'm pointing, that is the canal running along there, and this mill here is what is now the doctor's surgery. Over here is kind of B&M car park. This is across the other side of the canal, and I'm hoping we can look there because I think there might be a little bit left there. And this is the bridge that goes between the doctor's and Lidl car park today, and we're going to head to that bridge. And if you look at this building here that's on the side of the canal, there's evidence of that existence still showing today. So now we're on Stack Hills Road at the other side of the doctor's. This is the bridge that I've just pointed out when it was my little microscopic form. The bridge led to other parts of the mill complex at the other side. Now, there's not many pictures exist of these mills anymore, even though they were rebuilt. They were then closed down in the 1970s. I do have vague recollections when we drove through here when I was a child of seeing the mills, but I only moved here in 2005, and I think it was purely we stopped here for petrol. I'll show you what things do still exist here though. So this is the bridge as it is today, and this is how it looked about 20 years ago. This section, which is also on the canal, is part of the mill that still exists, and again 20 years or so ago it looked like this. So the 21st of January 1875, 500 people worked here at Lord Brothers factory, and 12:30 lunchtime the alarm sounds and people go off for an hour's break. Now if they live nearby, it's likely that they would have gone to their homes. There's certainly lots of homes across the other side where people worked, but those who couldn't go home stayed in the factory and found specific places to go and have their tea and have sandwiches, etc. Now, this was, I believe, part of the boiler house, and inside there were 3 large boilers which at 12:30 were also either switched off or turned down. So basically the mill fell silent for an hour whilst the workers had their break. When we reached 1:30-ish, at 1:28 in the afternoon, the workers started to return from wherever they were to the buildings that were here, and the boilers were switched back on again, ready for the afternoon. However, something went horrifically wrong and disaster happened. So there was a sudden roar of an explosion, steam escaping and buildings collapsing. The boiler house and the engine room practically disappeared in an instant, and the 5-storey mills that were around it, glass exploded, and the buildings started to fall around the workers who were in the mill or out in the yard. People were panicking and running everywhere. A lot of them tried to escape out into the yard, but they couldn't see anything because of the steam that had escaped had created this hot fog all around them. There was panic within the mills. People were leaping out of the buildings in frenzy and fear and falling to almost catastrophic heights, 5 stories high. Another issue had reared its head as the furnaces where the explosion had happened had suddenly broken, obviously, and were spewing hot cinders and ash in all directions, which could have had a catastrophic fire across the entire building. Thankfully, a fire engine was not far away. When the initial panic had died down, it was ascertained that what had happened is one of the boilers in the boiler house had exploded, and it had sent those pieces of the boiler flying everywhere. Such was the power of it that the other boilers, the other 2, had ended up out here onto the canal path. The buildings, the engine house, the boiler house, they were absolutely razed to the ground. Then, of course, what followed was the loss of life. The bodies of those who passed away were then recovered from the site, and it was found out that at least 6 people had initially died. That would go up to 7 in due course. But obviously a lot of people had also suffered catastrophic injuries from both the hot steam and falling from such a height. Some people were also reported missing. Potentially they'd been thrown by the blast into the canal. A few days later, an inquest was held at the Rope and Anchor, which included, for some reason, bringing the bodies to the pub, which by then had reached 7 fatalities, and they were put on display to the jury. Parts of the boiler and the mill were missing and had been thrown potentially 400 yards up onto the hillside. The damage to the mill was estimated at £10,000, and that was in 1875. Today, that covers roughly 1.2 million. It's rare you find a picture of a disaster from so far back, but this photograph was taken in 1875, the day of the disaster, and you can see one of the boilers there overhanging the mill. It was actually taken for a postcard. These were printed as postcards, which sounds a bit macabre today, but you can certainly see the devastation done. The ground is full of litter and twisted iron and metal and rocks, and you can see the buildings with the windows all smashed. So now we're heading back up Stack Hills Road over the bridge. You can see that similar pattern to what was the engine house. Now obviously this was all rebuilt after the disaster. As I say, it was here till about late 1970s, until this place changed completely. But I think there are some parts of the mill across the canal hidden in the woods, so we're just going to go and have a look at that. I'll return to the story shortly, but the way we're going with this video is we're going to cover the 7 people who tragically passed away on the day. Now, potentially there may have been others who passed away soon after from their injuries, but today we're just going to focus on the 7, and that's where obviously some of the graphic detail comes in. I'm not going to go into what happened in the inquest. It's very wordy, and as you can imagine it lasted quite some time, but I will tell you what happened at the end and who was claimed as being responsible. So we're across the other side of the canal now, and I think this is also potentially the ruins of a mill that would have been here. Not that there's much left to see today, but you can certainly picture that a mill would have been here, especially when the canal is just there. I think it would have been part of the complex. What do you think? So we're going to head to 3 graveyards: Crosstown, Christchurch, and then St Peter's in Wolston, to find the victims. Now I think we've found 6 of the graves. We may well find the 7th when we're there. Not quite sure what condition they've been, if they're readable, but we'll do what we can. So this is the location of the rope and anchor, as it was no longer. It did look like this. So our first graveyard location is Crosstone Graveyard, and we've been here a few times. So let's see if we can find 3 of the victims here. So we found our first gravestone here. This is of Richard Clegg of Stoneswood, who died January 21st, 1875 at 52. Richard Clegg was the person who was initially missing, and unfortunately his body was found a few days later after it had been blown into the canal by the explosion. So here's another grave, this one of Thomas Greenwood of Millwood, and again we see the same date, 21st, 1875. Thomas was found under a door. Basically when the explosion had happened, the door on the side of the mill must have blown out and completely flattened poor Thomas, and he was found under that. Not a good way to go. Okay, so this gravestone is for underneath this James Sutcliffe is the James Sutcliffe who died a few hours after the incident, and it says January. Actually says not sure what that is, but it's 21st again, 1875 at 20 years of age. Unfortunately, the details for James's passing are quite horrific. James was from Oldroyd. He was a weaver at the mill, and the description for James was that he'd been crushed by rocks, specifically crushed his head to the point where his brain was reportedly protruding from his skull, and he was in a state of such delirium that when they tried to help him, the doctors came to help him, he had to be held down by 3 people, and unfortunately, as you can probably imagine, he did pass away a bit later, so he was classed as the 7th victim. I did warn you that some of this could be quite graphic. Somewhere we think in Crosstone is also Smith Hodgins, who was a warehouse man who died there. He was also a member of Todmorden Brass Band, and he apparently very badly scalded everywhere, basically, his head, his neck, his arms, and officially I think passed away from the shock of that happening. We believe he's in Crosstone, but I'm afraid we can't find that grave today. Our next graveyard is our frequently visited Christ Church, and there are 2 graves here we're looking for. Now we are next to a school, so that is the noise you can hear. So this gravestone, I think, has only recently been uncovered again, and if you look, it says also of William Livesey, who died January 21st, 1875, aged 48, and William was the foreman, and his body was found under some rubble near one of the chimneys. 2 other bodies were found near to Livesey. Thomas Crowther, who was buried in Walsden, who we'll find in a minute, and also here is George Hiley, 45-year-old from Shade, who was a labourer, and again another member of Todmorden Brass Band. So John Hiley is in the private area, and has possibly also recently been recovered. We're not going over the fence, obviously, but his grave is that one there. And as I say, he was a labourer, and also found in the boiler house. Last graveyard today is St Peter's Church in Walsden. So all I've got for our youngest victim is a grave number, and unfortunately these ones don't seem to be numbered. Not who we're looking for, but that's an interesting first name. Pickup Ingham. A few war graves as well. Also here, and I've covered it on another video, are the 2 graves of the Walsden boys who fought against the Zulus. If I remember, I'll put a link onto that. So we've searched and searched, and although we've found a whole host of Crowthers, the Crowther that we wanted, which is Thomas Crowther, his is an unmarked grave here, and so unfortunately isn't a gravestone there, but this is where Thomas Crowther, who was a fluter from Walsden at the mill, also died in the boiler house, and yeah, he was the youngest, he was only 17. As I mentioned, there are a lot of Crowther graves here, so I don't know if these are relatives as well. Okay, so we've managed to find some of the gravestones. We haven't had any success in Walsden, but we did find the ones at Christchurch and some at Crosstone as well. So let's get back on track with the story and what happened at the inquest. to sum up what happened at the inquest, basically, Lord Brothers themselves, the brothers who owned the mill, they were not responsible for anything that had happened, nor really were any of the other employees. The blame was put upon a Mr. Edmund Woodhead, who was an engineer at the boiler house, who checked the boilers and believed that they were safe, and had said so. However, what it had missed is in the boiler that exploded, there'd been a lot of corrosion, and that was why, and the pressure was then built back up at 128 that afternoon. It had exploded and it had just been missed. Now, Edmund himself was also buried at Crossstone, so we'll see if we can find his grave. But before you think, oh, he was probably fired, locked up, whatever. Interestingly, Woodhead stayed employed with Lord Brothers and was actually employed by them for roughly 41 years before dying, I think about 1890 at the age of 75. Yeah, we'll see if we can find his grave en route. So this is the grave of the man who was classed as being responsible for the explosion. Mr. Edmund Woodhead. As I say, the responsibility, although he was kind of named as the responsible party for negligence, he wasn't blamed entirely. And what happened after the inquest had been held is that it was decided that there should be full government inspections on equipment in the future, not just to be responsibility of one man. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there were a lot of hardships going on for Todmorden at that time. Obviously there was suddenly, at this time, hundreds of people out of work, so that didn't make things easier. However, Lord Brothers was rebuilt and business continued as usual. So around February, just a few weeks after the event, two people also ended up in court because they claimed to be aid relief collectors and collecting money for the victims' families, and they weren't really. So, yeah, even then people were cashing in on other people's misfortune. Not sure what happened to them, so we'll leave the story there. So there we are, that is the story of the Lord Brothers Canal Street Mills boiler explosion of 1875. A disaster, one that hasn't been seen since, thankfully, in Todmorden. It's known as the worst industrial disaster, definitely, to hit the town. So it's probably been a bit wordy, this video, but I hope it's got the message across of what happened. We did manage to find some of the graves, which was good, and there is still a little bit of places left that we can show you. But yeah, let's always hope nothing like it is seen again. Okay guys, I shall see you for the next video soon.